They laughed when Walter Briggs said he would protect her, because no one in Red Hollow believed an old farmer could protect anything anymore. The wind moved slowly across the Kansas prairie that evening, bending the tall grass like waves on a quiet sea, and Walter Briggs stood alone beside the crooked fence of his 40-acre farm, the same farm he had worked with his hands for nearly 50 years. The wood of the barn behind him had faded to a tired gray, and the old windmill creaked every few seconds as it turned against the pale orange sky of sunset. In a place like Red Hollow, people measured a man by what he still had left to lose, and Walter Briggs did not seem to have much. His cattle herd had shrunk to 6 tired animals. His farmhouse leaned slightly to the west from decades of prairie storms, and the younger ranchers in town liked to whisper that the old man should have sold the land years ago. But Walter stayed. He always stayed, because sometimes a man stays not for what the land gives him, but for what the land remembers. That evening had started like most evenings for Walter Briggs. He had finished repairing a broken fence rail near the south pasture, wiped the dust from his hands, and walked slowly toward the barn as the sun sank low over the plains. The air smelled of dry grass, leather, and distant rain somewhere far beyond the hills. His boots crunched softly on the gravel path when he heard it. Not a voice, not a shout, just the sound of something small shifting against the wooden wall of the barn. Walter stopped. Out here, sounds mattered. Coyotes sometimes wandered close to the cattle. Travelers occasionally crossed the prairie looking for water. But this sound was different. Careful, weak, like someone trying not to be heard. He moved slowly around the corner of the barn, the fading sunlight stretching his shadow across the dirt. And that was when he saw her. A young Apache girl sat on the ground beside the barn wall, her back pressed against the weathered boards, her breathing shallow from exhaustion after what must have been a long journey across the prairie. Her dark hair was tangled with dust from the trail, and her clothes were worn from travel. But what caught Walter's attention most was the way she held herself, quiet, alert, like someone who had learned the hard way that the world could turn dangerous without warning. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The prairie wind whispered through the fence posts, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark called across the open land. Walter could see fear in her eyes, but there was something else there too. Determination. The kind that belonged to someone who had already come too far to turn back now. In Red Hollow, people talked about Apache riders the way they talked about distant storms, something powerful that moved across the land but rarely came this far east. And if the town ever heard that Walter Briggs had given shelter to an Apache girl, there would be questions. Hard questions. But Walter Briggs had lived long enough to know that sometimes a man did not need all the answers before deciding what kind of man he wanted to be. He removed his hat slowly and spoke in the calm, steady voice that had once quieted frightened cattle during midnight storms. "You look like you've traveled a long way, miss." The girl watched him carefully, measuring every movement. Then she nodded once, the motion small but certain. Walter looked across the empty prairie behind her. No riders. No dust clouds. No one following, at least not yet. The sun dropped lower, painting the horizon deep gold as evening settled over the plains. In another hour the prairie would turn dark, and the cold night wind would begin to sweep down from the north. Walter Briggs studied the girl for a long moment, then opened the barn door beside them with a slow pull of the handle. Inside, the barn smelled of hay, leather, and the quiet warmth of animals settling in for the night. He stepped aside and said the simplest words he knew. "You can stay here tonight." The girl did not move at first, as if the offer itself surprised her. Then she slowly stood, steadying herself against the barn wall before stepping inside the shelter of the old wooden building. Walter closed the door behind them as the last light of the prairie faded across the fields. Neither of them noticed the thin line of distant dust beginning to rise far out on the western horizon, where riders were already moving across the open land. The barn settled into the quiet rhythm of night as the last color of sunset disappeared beyond the western hills, and Walter Briggs lit a small lantern that hung from a rusted hook near the stall door, its warm yellow glow spreading slowly across the old wooden beams and the piles of dry hay stacked along the wall. The girl stood just inside the doorway at first, as if she was not yet certain the shelter truly belonged to her for the night, her dark eyes moving carefully across the barn the way a traveler studies a new landscape before trusting it. Walter noticed the dust on her boots and the faint stiffness in the way she held one leg, signs of someone who had walked many miles without rest across rough prairie ground. He set the lantern on a wooden crate and filled a small tin cup from the water barrel that stood near the back wall. The water was cool from the well outside, and he handed the cup to her without saying anything more. She accepted it slowly, still watching him with quiet caution, then drank in small careful sips the way a person does when they have been thirsty for longer than they want to admit. The cattle in the next stall shifted softly in the straw, their slow breathing blending with the distant sound of wind brushing across the prairie grass outside. Walter leaned one shoulder against the barn post and studied the girl in the steady lantern light. She could not have been more than 16 years old, maybe 17 at most, but there was a seriousness in her face that belonged to someone who had already seen more of the world than a young person should. After a moment, she lowered the cup and spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "My name is Ayana." Walter nodded once, as if the name had been something he expected all along. "That is a strong name," he said. The girl seemed surprised that he knew it. Walter shrugged slightly and glanced toward the open barn window where the prairie wind slipped through the boards. "I have been living on this land long enough to learn a few things about the people who ride across it." Ayana looked down at the cup in her hands as if weighing whether she should say more. The lantern flame flickered softly between them while the prairie night settled deeper outside. Finally she spoke again. "I did not mean to come here." Walter answered with a quiet half-smile. Most travelers who reached this farm did not plan on it either. She hesitated, then added, "I was trying to stay off the main trails." That sentence carried more meaning than the words themselves. Walter understood that much. Out here on the plains, a person did not avoid the trails unless there was someone else on those trails they wished to avoid. Walter walked toward a stack of folded blankets near the stall and pulled one free, shaking the dust from it before setting it gently on a clean patch of hay. "You can rest there tonight," he said. "The nights get cold once the sun is gone." Ayana looked toward the barn door, as if expecting someone to appear in the darkness beyond it. "Are you not afraid of helping me?" she asked quietly. Walter rested both hands on the top rail of the stall and considered the question for a moment before answering. "Fear is a strange thing on the prairie," he said slowly. "Some people fear storms. Some people fear drought. Some people fear the neighbors more than either one." He met her eyes again. "But a tired traveler asking for a place to rest is not the kind of thing I have ever learned to fear." The words seemed to settle something inside her. She sat down slowly on the hay, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little for the first time since Walter had found her beside the barn wall. Outside, the windmill turned with its familiar creaking rhythm, while the prairie stretched quiet and dark for miles in every direction. For a while neither of them spoke. Walter adjusted the lantern wick while Ayana rested against the barn boards, her eyes half closed from exhaustion after the long miles she must have crossed to reach this place. But far beyond the quiet farm, beyond the rolling grasslands where the moonlight now painted the hills silver, the faint line of dust that had appeared on the western horizon earlier had grown larger. Riders were moving steadily across the prairie under the rising stars, their horses covering mile after mile of open land, following a trail that led directly toward the lonely farm where Walter Briggs had just offered shelter to a girl who had been running for a very long time. The prairie night passed slowly over Walter Briggs's farm, the kind of deep quiet that only exists far away from towns and railroad tracks, where the wind carries every small sound across miles of open land. Inside the barn, the lantern had burned low, its golden glow shrinking to a soft circle of light, while the cattle settled into their steady breathing and the old wooden boards creaked as the temperature dropped. Walter Briggs did not sleep much that night. A man who has spent 50 years on the prairie learns to listen even when he pretends to rest. He sat on a wooden stool near the barn door, his hat pulled low and his eyes half closed. But every few minutes his gaze drifted to the dark horizon beyond the fields. The girl Ayana slept against the stack of hay where he had left the blanket, exhaustion finally overcoming the careful watchfulness she had carried all evening. At some point near midnight she stirred slightly and opened her eyes long enough to see the old farmer still sitting there near the door, watching the prairie the way a lighthouse watches the ocean. She did not speak. She simply closed her eyes again, perhaps understanding that the quiet guard at the door meant she was safe for the moment. Outside, the sky stretched wide and clear above the plains, filled with more stars than most townspeople ever see in a lifetime. The windmill creaked slowly as it turned in the gentle breeze, and the long grass whispered against itself in the darkness. Hours passed that way, but long before the first hint of sunrise touched the eastern hills, the prairie carried a new sound across the land. At first it was so distant that it blended with the wind. Then it grew clearer. Hoofbeats. Several horses moving together across the open ground. Walter Briggs opened his eyes fully and tilted his head slightly, listening with the careful attention of someone who had spent half a century reading the language of the plains. Riders. More than two. Perhaps three. Maybe four. He stood slowly and stepped outside the barn, leaving the lantern light behind him. The air was cold and sharp, and the grass was silver with early morning dew under the fading starlight. Walter walked a few steps into the yard and looked west across the dark prairie. At first he saw nothing. Then a faint line of dust appeared against the horizon, barely visible in the dim gray light that comes just before dawn. Riders were approaching his farm. Behind him the barn door creaked softly as Ayanna stepped outside, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She followed his gaze toward the distant movement across the prairie. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then she said quietly, "They found me." Walter did not turn around. The old farmer simply watched the riders growing slowly larger against the horizon while the sky above them began to brighten with the first pale colors of morning. "How many?" he asked calmly. Ayanna studied the distant shapes with the careful eyes of someone used to watching riders from far away. "4," she answered after a moment. Walter nodded once as if that number had already been expected. The riders continued across the prairie, their horses moving at a steady pace now that they could see the small farm ahead of them. The rising sun slowly revealed their shapes more clearly. For men wearing dust-covered coats and wide hats, the kind worn by ranch hands who spend most of their lives in the saddle. One of them rode slightly ahead of the others, guiding the group directly toward the barn. Ayanna stepped closer to Walter, her voice barely above a whisper. "They will say I did something wrong." Walter finally looked at her then. His face carried the calm expression of a man who had already made a decision long before the riders arrived. "People say many things when they want something," he replied quietly. The hoofbeats grew louder as the riders crossed the final stretch of open field. The horses slowed as they approached the fence line, their breath visible in the cool morning air. The lead rider pulled his horse to a stop about 30 feet from Walter Briggs and the barn. For a few seconds the prairie was completely silent again except for the wind turning the old windmill above the well. Then the rider spoke. "Morning, old man." His voice carried the casual tone of someone who expected cooperation. Walter Briggs rested one hand on the top rail of the fence and answered calmly. "Morning." The rider glanced toward the barn and then back at Walter. "We are looking for a girl who came this way last night," he said. "Young. Apache. Might be hurt." He paused and studied the old farmer carefully before adding, "You have not seen anyone like that around here, have you?" Walter Briggs did not answer right away. Instead, he looked slowly across his quiet fields, the same fields he had worked for nearly half a century, and then back toward the riders waiting in the early morning light. Walter Briggs let the question rest in the cool morning air for a moment while the prairie wind moved slowly through the fence posts, carrying the faint smell of dust and dry grass across the yard. The riders watched him carefully from their saddles, the lead man leaning slightly forward as if trying to read the old farmer's face the way a gambler studies cards on a table. Behind Walter, Ayanna stood quietly near the barn door, the blanket still around her shoulders, saying nothing and barely moving, yet every muscle in her body was alert. The old farmer finally lifted his eyes from the field and looked directly at the man on the horse. "I have seen travelers pass through these plains before," he said slowly, his voice calm and steady. "But last night was quiet." The lead rider studied him for a long moment without speaking. The other three men shifted slightly in their saddles, their horses stamping softly in the morning grass while the rising sun painted the horizon with pale gold light. The man's eyes drifted briefly toward the barn behind Walter, then back again. "Funny thing about quiet nights," he said. "Sometimes they hide things people would rather not talk about." Walter rested both hands on the fence rail and shrugged slightly, as if the comment meant little to him. "The prairie hides many things," he answered. "Lost cattle, broken wagons, Men who ride too far from home. The rider gave a short breath that might have been a laugh, though it carried little humor. We are not looking for cattle, old man. We are looking for a girl. Young Apache girl traveling alone. He paused and added carefully, she does not belong out here by herself. Walter glanced briefly across the empty fields again before answering. This land belongs to the wind more than it belongs to anyone, he said quietly. People pass through it when they must. The lead rider narrowed his eyes slightly, as if the old farmer's calm replies were not quite what he had expected. He shifted in the saddle and pointed casually toward the barn with one gloved hand. Mind if we take a look inside that barn? He asked, just to be certain no traveler wandered in during the night. Walter followed the direction of the man's hand and looked at the barn door as if considering the idea for the first time. The old wooden building stood exactly as it had for decades, weathered boards faded by sun and wind, the roof sloping slightly where an old storm had bent the beams years ago. After a moment Walter spoke again. The barn holds hay and tired cattle, he said. If you are hoping to find anything more interesting than that, you may be disappointed. The man did not smile this time. One of the riders behind him leaned forward and spoke quietly enough that only the group could hear, but the prairie wind carried the tone clearly. We tracked her this far, he muttered. She did not vanish into thin air. The lead rider lifted one hand slightly, and the others fell silent again. His attention remained fixed on Walter Briggs. You have been living on this farm a long time, have you not? He asked. Long enough to know the difference between someone who answers a question and someone who walks around it. Walter's face did not change. I have been living here long enough to know that travelers sometimes carry trouble with them, he replied. And sometimes the wisest thing a man can do is allow them to keep riding. The rider held his gaze for several seconds, weighing the words carefully. Behind Walter, Ayanna slowly lowered her eyes toward the ground, understanding that the moment balanced on something fragile that could break with a single wrong word. The prairie wind turned the old windmill again, its familiar creak echoing softly across the yard. Finally, the lead rider sat back slightly in the saddle and looked across the fields surrounding the farm. Quiet place you have here, he said. Walter nodded once. It has stayed that way for many years. The man studied the barn one last time before returning his attention to the old farmer. Well, he said after a pause, if the girl passes through here, you might want to remember something. Walter waited. The rider's voice grew slightly colder, though it remained calm. Some travelers bring trouble that spreads farther than a man expects. He touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse slowly toward the open prairie. Come on, boys, he said to the others. The riders pulled their horses around and began moving back toward the wide grasslands they had crossed earlier that morning. For several long seconds Walter Briggs remained standing at the fence while the hoofbeats faded slowly into the distance. Only when the riders had become small figures against the horizon did he finally turn back toward the barn, where Ayanna still stood quietly beside the door, watching the place where the men had disappeared. Walter Briggs remained at the fence long after the riders had disappeared beyond the western ridge, his eyes still following the empty horizon as the prairie wind brushed across the tall grass. The sound of hoofbeats had faded, but the silence they left behind felt heavier than before. Ayanna stood beside the barn door, watching him carefully, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders against the cool morning air. The rising sun had begun to spread warm light across the fields, turning the dew on the grass into tiny sparks of gold, yet the calm of the morning did not reach the quiet space between them. After a long moment Walter finally spoke without turning around. They will come back. Ayanna did not ask how he knew. She had heard the same certainty in the rider's voice. They believe I am still nearby, she said softly. Walter nodded once and turned from the fence, walking slowly back toward the barn. The boards creaked under his boots as he stepped inside and reached for the small kettle hanging near the stove in the corner of the old farmhouse kitchen. The smell of coffee soon filled the air, drifting through the open doorway toward the barn. Ayanna followed him quietly, still cautious, but no longer trembling with the same fear she had carried the night before. Walter poured 2 cups and handed one to her. Drink, he said. The morning is colder than it looks. She accepted the cup with both hands and watched the steam rise from the dark liquid. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then Ayanna reached beneath the collar of her worn shirt and pulled out a small object hanging from a leather cord around her neck. It was a pendant made of polished turquoise stone wrapped carefully in silver wire. The stone caught the morning sunlight and reflected a deep blue glow against the wooden table between them. Walter studied the pendant quietly. "That is not something travelers usually carry alone," he said. Ayanna nodded slowly. "My father gave it to me." Walter lifted his eyes. "Your father must be a man of some importance among your people." Ayanna hesitated for a moment before answering. "My father is Dakota." The name settled into the room with quiet weight. Walter Briggs had lived on the prairie long enough to hear that name before. The wind outside moved across the wheat field behind the house while the old windmill turned slowly above the well. "Chief Dakota," Walter said at last. "I have heard that name carried by the wind many times over the years." Ayanna watched his reaction carefully. "Many people say he is dangerous." Walter gave a small thoughtful nod. "Many people say many things about men they do not understand." Ayanna looked down at the turquoise pendant again, her voice quieter now. "The men who came here this morning are not looking for me because I am lost." Walter leaned back slightly in his chair, waiting. "They are looking for me because they believe I carry something valuable," she continued. She gently turned the pendant in her fingers. "They think this stone shows where silver can be found in the hills beyond the valley." Walter raised one eyebrow slightly. "Does it?" Ayanna shook her head. "No. It shows where my people buried something more important." Walter remained silent, letting her continue when she was ready. "My father told me to leave the camp and travel east if strangers began asking about the hills. He said if I reached the farms beyond the prairie, someone there might understand what it means to protect something that does not belong to them." Ayanna lifted her eyes again and met Walter's steady gaze across the table. "I did not know where I would go. I only knew I had to keep traveling until I found a place where someone would listen." Walter took a slow sip of coffee and looked through the open doorway toward the endless prairie stretching beyond. His fields. The land had been quiet here for decades, but he understood something about quiet places. Quiet places often became important when trouble began to move across the land. He set the cup down gently on the table. "Then it seems you found exactly the place you were meant to find," he said calmly. Ayanna looked surprised. Walter gave a faint smile and stood, walking back toward the door where the morning sun now shone brightly across the farmyard. Out on the horizon, far to the west where the riders had vanished earlier, a faint line of dust had begun to appear once again. Walter Briggs stood in the doorway of the farmhouse with the morning sun warming the wooden porch boards beneath his boots, his eyes fixed on the thin ribbon of dust slowly rising along the western horizon. The prairie was wide enough to hide a man for days, but dust had a way of telling the truth long before riders arrived. Behind him inside the small kitchen, Ayanna stepped quietly toward the doorway and followed his gaze across the endless stretch of grassland. For a moment neither of them spoke. The windmill turned slowly beside the well, its familiar creaking sound mixing with the soft rustling of wheat in the field beyond the barn. Finally Ayanna said what both of them already understood. "They turned around sooner than I hoped." Walter nodded slightly, still studying the horizon the way a sailor studies distant waves. "Men who ride that far for a single girl do not give up easily," he said calmly. The dust line grew thicker as the riders continued across the prairie, the early sun reflecting faintly off the metal pieces of their saddles. Walter counted the shapes carefully. 4 riders again. The same men. They had only circled far enough away to decide their next move. Walter stepped down from the porch and walked slowly across the yard toward the fence, his movements steady and unhurried, like a man finishing ordinary chores rather than preparing for trouble. Ayanna watched him with quiet concern. "What will you do?" she asked. Walter rested his arms on the fence rail and looked back toward the approaching riders. "I will do what farmers have always done on this land," he said. "I will stand where my land begins and see what comes across it." Ayanna stepped closer beside him, her turquoise pendant catching the sunlight again as it moved gently against her chest. "You do not have to protect me," she said softly. "My father told me never to let strangers carry the burden meant for our people." Walter gave a small thoughtful breath and shook his head. "The burden arrived on this farm the moment those riders crossed my fence line this morning," he replied. "Once trouble knows where a man lives, ignoring it rarely makes it disappear." The riders were closer now, their horses moving at a steady trot across the tall prairie grass. The lead man raised one arm to signal the others, and they slowed slightly as they approached the farmyard once again. The prairie seemed to grow quieter with each passing second. Even the wind moved more gently across the fields. Walter glanced briefly toward the barn where the old cattle shifted quietly in their stalls, unaware of the tension building outside. Then he looked toward the wide stretch of land beyond the eastern fields. Miles of open prairie lay in that direction, untouched except for the occasional wagon trail that cut across the grass like a faint scar. Ayanna followed his gaze and understood what he was measuring. "Could I reach the river if I left now?" she asked quietly. Walter studied the distance thoughtfully. "If you started walking this moment and did not stop, you might reach the river by late afternoon," he said. "But those riders would follow every step of your trail across the grass." The wind had begun to carry the clear sound of hoofbeats again. The riders slowed their horses as they approached the same spot near the fence where they had spoken earlier. The lead rider removed his hat and wiped his forehead with a cloth before settling it back on his head. He looked far less patient now than he had an hour before. "Walter Briggs," he called across the yard. The old farmer did not move from the fence. The rider pointed toward the barn again, though his voice carried less politeness this time. "We have had some time to think about our conversation earlier." Walter waited. The rider continued slowly, choosing his words with careful weight. "A girl like the one we described does not vanish in open country. And if she did wander into this farm during the night, it would be best for everyone if she came forward now." The prairie wind brushed gently across the fields again while the riders waited for Walter Briggs to answer. Walter Briggs did not answer the rider right away. The old farmer kept both hands resting on the fence rail, his eyes moving slowly across the four men sitting on their horses as if he were studying weather clouds rolling across the prairie. Beside him, Ayanna stood very still, the turquoise pendant resting against her chest and catching the bright morning light. The prairie wind moved softly through the wheat field behind them, and for a moment the entire farm seemed suspended in a quiet that felt almost unnatural. Finally Walter spoke in the same calm voice he had used all morning. "I told you earlier that this farm had a quiet night," he said. The lead rider leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "I remember what you said." The man removed his hat and wiped the dust from his brow again, though the air was still cool from the early hour. "What I also remember is that the trail we followed led straight across your land." Walter gave a small nod. Trails often cross land without asking permission. The rider glanced briefly toward Ayanna, noticing her standing beside the farmer now instead of hidden inside the barn. His eyes narrowed slightly, and the three men behind him shifted in their saddles as if the moment they had been expecting had finally arrived. "There she is," the rider said quietly. Ayanna lifted her chin but did not step back. Walter remained exactly where he was, his posture steady and unhurried. The rider studied the old farmer again. "I gave you a chance earlier," he said. "Now we will ask one last time. That girl belongs with us." Walter slowly turned his head toward Ayanna and then back toward the men. "Belongs is a heavy word to use about another human being," he replied calmly. The rider gave a short laugh that carried little humor. "Old man, you are standing in the middle of something that does not concern you." Walter rested his weight slightly against the fence rail. "I have been standing in this exact place for 30 years, he said quietly. "That tends to make things my concern." The horses shifted restlessly while the prairie wind brushed through the grass. The lead rider studied Walter's weathered face for several seconds as if trying to understand what kind of man he was dealing with. Finally he spoke again, this time more slowly. "You think protecting her is a simple act of kindness, but you do not know what she carries." Walter glanced briefly at the pendant around Ayanna's neck. "Sometimes people carry things that others have no right to take," he said. The rider's expression hardened slightly. "You think you understand this situation?" Walter answered without raising his voice. "I understand that 4 men rode 30 miles across open prairie looking for a single girl. That tells me enough." The silence stretched again, broken only by the distant creak of the windmill turning beside the well. One of the riders behind the leader leaned forward and spoke quietly. "We could search the barn anyway." The lead rider lifted a hand slightly, stopping him. His eyes remained fixed on Walter Briggs. Something in the old farmer's calm stillness seemed to give him pause. The prairie wind picked up slightly, carrying the smell of sun-warmed grass across the yard. Then Ayanna spoke for the first time since the riders had returned. "My father knows where I went," she said clearly. The rider's gaze shifted to her. "Does he?" Ayanna nodded. "He told me to travel east until I found someone who would listen." The man gave a skeptical breath. And you believe that old farmer is the man he meant? Walter did not move, but Ayanna answered before he could speak. Yes. The rider studied her for a moment, then looked back toward the horizon beyond the farm, as if measuring distances in his mind. The prairie stretched wide and open behind him, but something had changed in the air that none of the men had yet noticed. Walter Briggs had noticed it first. A faint vibration carried across the ground beneath his boots, subtle but unmistakable to someone who had lived on the land long enough to feel its movements. The old farmer lifted his eyes toward the distant hills beyond the eastern prairie. Far away, almost too far to see clearly in the bright morning sun, another line of dust had begun to rise across the horizon. The prairie wind shifted slightly, carrying with it a low tremor that rolled gently through the ground beneath Walter Briggs's boots. It was not loud, and it was not yet obvious, but to someone who had lived half a century listening to the language of open land, the signal was unmistakable. Riders. Many riders. Walter lifted his eyes toward the eastern horizon, where the prairie stretched mile after mile under the bright morning sun. The lead rider near the fence was still watching Ayanna, waiting for her to step forward, but Walter's attention had moved beyond them now. Far away, nearly 3 miles out across the grasslands, a faint curtain of dust had begun to rise into the clear blue sky. At first it looked like nothing more than wind lifting dry soil from the prairie floor. But the shape of it told a different story. Ayanna noticed the change in Walter's gaze and followed it east. Her breath caught slightly when she saw it. The dust was spreading wider across the horizon with every passing moment. The 4 riders near the fence had not noticed yet. Their horses shifted impatiently in the grass while the lead man spoke again, his voice still calm, but carrying a harder edge than before. "This is the last time I will ask politely, old man," he said. "Send the girl with us, and we all ride away." Walter did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked slowly back toward the rider, and then once more toward the distant horizon where the dust line continued to grow. The prairie wind carried a new sound now, faint but steady. Hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. The lead rider finally noticed Walter's attention drifting away and frowned slightly. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Walter rested his hands on the fence rail again and nodded toward the east. "Weather," he said simply. The rider turned his head to glance over his shoulder. At first he saw nothing but open prairie glowing under the rising sun. Then one of the men behind him shifted in his saddle and leaned forward slightly, squinting toward the distant hills. "Hold on," he murmured quietly. The lead rider turned again, this time studying the horizon more carefully. The thin curtain of dust was much larger now, spreading across a wide stretch of land nearly 2 miles away. Even from that distance the movement was unmistakable. A large group of riders was crossing the prairie. The men on horseback near the fence exchanged uneasy glances. The lead rider narrowed his eyes and tried to count shapes through the shimmering air. 10 riders, he muttered. No, more than that. The vibration in the ground beneath the farmyard grew stronger, carrying through the wooden fence posts and into the quiet fields surrounding the barn. The cattle inside shifted restlessly as the distant thunder of hooves rolled across the plains like approaching weather. Ayanna stood quietly beside Walter, her turquoise pendant glowing bright blue in the sunlight. She did not smile, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly as she watched the approaching dust cloud grow wider and darker. The lead rider slowly turned back toward her. "Who did you say your father was?" he asked again, though his voice carried less confidence now. Ayanna met his eyes calmly. "Takota." The name seemed to hang in the warm morning air. One of the riders behind the leader breathed out softly. The dust cloud was less than a mile away now, and the shapes within it were finally clear. Dozens of riders moved together across the prairie in long, steady lines, their horses running with the smooth rhythm of people who had ridden these lands their entire lives. Sunlight flashed across metal ornaments, braided leather, and the long feathers tied into dark hair that streamed behind them in the wind. The lead rider turned slowly in his saddle as the approaching group spread outward across the prairie, forming a wide arc that stretched far beyond the edges of Walter Briggs's fields. No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound was the growing thunder of hooves and the steady turning of the windmill beside the well. Walter Briggs remained leaning on the fence rail as if he had been expecting the moment all along. Finally, the first line of riders slowed near the edge of the farm, their horses stepping down from a gallop to a calm, controlled walk. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They simply rode forward and formed a quiet circle around the open land surrounding the farmhouse and barn. At the front of the riders, a tall man guided his horse slowly toward the fence where Walter and Ayanna stood waiting. The tall rider guided his horse slowly to the fence line where Walter Briggs stood waiting, the animal's hooves stepping quietly through the morning grass, while the long circle of riders spread across the prairie behind him. Nearly 40 Apache warriors now surrounded the farm at a respectful distance, their horses calm, their faces steady, their presence filling the open land like a silent wall that stretched far beyond the wheat fields and the weathered barn. The 4 riders who had come searching earlier sat frozen in their saddles near the fence, their confidence drained away by the quiet arrival of so many watchful eyes. The tall rider stopped his horse 10 feet from Walter Briggs and looked down at the old farmer with calm, measured respect. His hair was braided with silver beads and dark feathers that moved gently in the prairie wind, and his eyes carried the quiet focus of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the land and the people who crossed it. For several seconds neither man spoke. The windmill turned slowly beside the well while the distant horses shifted in the grass. Then the rider's gaze moved from Walter to Ayanna standing beside him. The young girl stepped forward slightly, the turquoise pendant resting against her chest and glowing softly in the sunlight. "Father," she said quietly. The tall rider nodded once, his expression softening for the first time. He dismounted from his horse and stepped forward across the grass until he stood only a few feet from the fence. The 4 riders who had chased Ayanna watched the scene in complete silence now, uncertain whether to move or remain exactly where they were. The man known across the prairie as Chief Takota rested one hand gently on the top rail of the fence and looked at Walter Briggs. "My daughter tells me you gave her shelter when she arrived here last night," he said in a calm voice that carried easily across the farmyard. Walter nodded once. She looked like she had traveled far and needed rest. Takota studied the old farmer carefully, as if measuring the truth behind his simple words. "Many people on this land would have turned her away," he said. Walter shrugged slightly. "A tired traveler at the door is not something I was raised to refuse." The chief's eyes lingered on Walter for another moment before he turned his head slowly toward the 4 men still sitting uneasily on their horses nearby. The silence that followed was heavy but controlled. The riders shifted in their saddles under the weight of so many watchful Apache warriors surrounding the farm. Takota did not raise his voice. He simply spoke with calm authority. "The girl you followed belongs with her people," he said. The prairie wind carried his words across the open land. The lead rider who had questioned Walter earlier swallowed and adjusted his hat nervously before speaking. "We believed she carried something that belonged to our company," he said. Takota glanced briefly at the turquoise pendant resting against Ayanna's chest. "Some things do not belong to companies," he replied quietly. "They belong to the land and the people who protect it." The rider hesitated, looking around at the long line of warriors encircling the farm. Finally, he nodded slowly and touched the brim of his hat. "Then we will leave this matter behind us," he said. The 4 riders turned their horses and began moving away across the prairie without another word. No one followed them. The Apache warriors remained exactly where they were until the riders had disappeared beyond the distant hills. Only then did Takota turn back toward Walter Briggs. The chief studied the small farmhouse, the aging barn, and the quiet fields that surrounded them. Then he gave a single signal with his hand. Instantly the warriors guiding their horses around the farm shifted position, spreading themselves along the edges of Walter's land like silent guardians watching the prairie. Takota looked back at the old farmer and spoke one final time. "A man who protects my daughter becomes a friend to my people," he said. "From this day forward your farm will stand under our protection." Walter Briggs looked across the wide prairie where dozens of Apache riders now watched the land around him, their horses calm beneath the bright Kansas sky. The old farmer rested his arms on the fence rail again and gave a quiet nod. The wind moved gently through the wheat field while the sun climbed higher above the plains, and for the first time in many years the lonely farm at the edge of Red Hollow no longer stood alone.